All right. Well, good morning, Greg, and hello to all of our listeners. We appreciate the continued support, and those of you who've been checking out the Patreon site and sharing the podcast with friends. That helps us out a lot and giving us the reviews and stuff that you have. So we do appreciate that and want to get that right off the bat here today. But today's topic is going to be about zero tolerance policies, and sort of the reason we're having this is we had a brief Patreon discussion about it. And, our thoughts were, well, we could probably do an entire podcast on it. And then one of our Patreon members, like their first comment was like, you should do an entire
Exactly.
podcast on this. So, which is, what we kind of knew going into it, but there's some, there's a lot to unpack with it. And so the reason sort of we're talking about this is because we have a bunch of different examples of how, a zero tolerance policy is implemented, and it has like horrible catastrophic second and third order effects. And there's reasons why people want zero tolerance policies where their intent might be great and might make sense, but when it comes to policy level stuff, like you're not going to ever know completely how it's going to work, but like you can plan for some of these things. And so I want to get into that and answer a few questions about why as humans we come up with these things in the first place, and what their actual effects are. And we got a bunch of different stories, and I'll put links in some of the episode details. And for the Patreon members, I'll put links to all this stuff, in a post so you can check it out. But there was one that I wanted to kind of start with, Greg, and it came out of Chicago. And there was a shooting at a high school in the Pilsen neighborhood, if anyone's familiar with that
Mhm.
area. Benito Juarez High School. I actually had a buddy I grew up with. His mom taught there. But it was then the response to it, because there was this kind of shooting, and typically in those situations it's more like a gang type thing, not like a school attack, in the sense of a school shooting. It's a school that takes place or shooting that takes place on school grounds. But basically, the gist of it is there was problems. The Chicago Public School, administrators, teachers, principal there were like not divulging information to the police for their investigation. And so what they were saying was that, well, this kind of violates our policy on what we can and cannot share. And we're not allowed to give this. We have to protect the students. And the police are sitting there going like, look, we have an ongoing investigation. We need this information. So the Chicago Public School folks were like, hey, you got to talk to our legal department. And there was sort of this what seemingly misinterpreted or ambiguous policy where they're only allowed to share certain things with the police in, like, in emergent situations, and in situations like, a shooting, an active shooter incident or something, right? So it was unclear as to, now this is just an investigation to something that was connected because everyone involved were current and former members of this school. So fast forward, what happens, it hampers the investigation. They don't end up making arrests until I think a couple months later. And in the meantime, one of the people they did arrest was involved in another shooting in the meantime. So what happens is this slows things down. It's tough for prosecution, and then now you're going to trial, and they're going to sit there, and the defense is going to go, well, wait a minute, why didn't you investigate this further? Or why didn't you press charges sooner? Because maybe you didn't have such a great case, or what's going on. So it really makes the situation worse. And so in that case, they had this sort of zero tolerance policy in place.
Yeah.
And it's a great one. You can read the story. I'll put the link in there because it shows all kinds of the different bureaucratic things that happen between, in any major metropolitan area, between public school system, police, advocacy groups, lack of oversight or after action review when these incidents happen. It's just, we're going to make this policy, and then you're expected to adhere to the policy, because that policy, well, here, it says it right here. We can point to it on the wall. That's what it is. And and most of our listeners know this, it's just not that simple sometimes. So that's kind of the big one that everyone can kind of jump into and read about if they want, Greg. But like, want to throw to you, because I've been talking now for a few minutes, but I want to throw to you to kind of get the conversation started about zero tolerance policies. And I know you have some other great examples that we're going to talk about throughout here, but I have a few questions that I eventually want to get to,
Yeah.
of basically, why do we create these zero tolerance policies? What's the intent? do they work, and what are the effects of these policies? Like, what do they lead to, sort of at a sort of sociological, societal level, in terms of handling these things? So
Yeah.
we don't need to answer those right up front right now. We'll get to them, but I want to throw to
Yeah.
you first, Greg.
So, uh, again, 5 minutes. I've written an entire page of notes on what you said. So, folks, good morning. And Brian is using the Tommy Boy defense. The guarantee is on the
Yeah,
box. I like that, and I also see the irony in the superintendent and the school administrator saying we have to protect the students after 2 students were shot and 2 were killed from this incident,
right,
from a
right.
16-year-old doing it.
Yeah.
Okay, the irony
The
is
irony is quite,
ridiculous.
it's quite thick on this
It's
one.
overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the simple answer is that the chief of police and their representative told the school administrator and their safety and security people that the emergency of this shooting warranted their cooperation immediately. And in fact, what happened, it was so many high-ranking fights back and forth that it stretched out over 2 months. And then
Hmm.
even to the point of the coppers, the Chicago coppers saying, "Hey, look," the prosecutors, matter of fact, saying, "We're going to charge these guys with obstruction of justice," and that's ridiculous. Even the attorney for the 16-year-old who did it, the
Yeah.
16-year-old that had been kicked out of Benito Juarez Community Academy, then fatally shoots 2 and wounds 2 other in December of 2022. Now this is stretched to 2024. This just was adjudicated
Yep.
last month. So the kid's attorney even asked, "Hey, listen, if he did it, why did it take 2 months to arrest him?"
Yeah.
Well, now we know. Okay, so the idea is that the policy became more important than helping police identify the shooter. And as Brian said, it created a cascading effect that not only casted a pall over the shooting and the school and the community's recovery from the shooting, but the subsequent arrest of the kid. And then it felt as though it was a weak case. It wasn't a weak case at all. There were a number of witnesses that saw the shooting. There were videotapes
Right.
of the shooting. There were
Videos. Yeah.
all these other things that were going on, but the mere fact that the number one cork, the stopper that was in the flow, was the school going, "Well, we're not sure if we can do it." There's so many protections for schools, and specifically when a school thinks that there's dangerous intent, they can go so much more broadly than merely reasonable suspicion or probable cause allows a regular copper to go on the street, Brian. And so this is one that is emblematic of why we don't have or why you and I personally, I should say, don't support zero tolerance policies. Now, we know that they still exist, and we know that there's some around. And I have horror stories about some that I personally witnessed. But
Yeah.
this one just epitomizes what could go horribly wrong. And Brian, you got to remember, what do you think the families of those dead kids or shot kids thought
Yeah.
when they know what's going on and this kid is still out in the community? You get what I'm trying to say? And here we got this infighting that's raising to the level of charges, and it's on the news every night. That had to be
Yeah.
just horrific.
So zero tolerance policies are big in
Yeah.
schools, especially. Like,
Yep.
you have them in all different areas, but they're, especially when it comes to school safety, or they're trying to
Yep.
keep kids safe and prevent school shootings, do this. So you have to have certain measures in place, which I get it. So the
Yep.
first question is, why do we have these policies? It's the intent is, of course, like, we want to make, the schools safer. That's what we're trying to do with this. And we have to handle things in a certain manner, and certain behavior is not going to be tolerated. In fact,
Yep.
there's zero tolerance. But when you do that, it really oversimplifies the issue, in my opinion. And what it does is it takes away any sort of discretion that someone locally on the ground can make and have. and
Exactly.
and that's a big problem, because that's kind of, that's actually, the opposite of how our legal system works, right? I mean, the point of our legal systems, yes, you have a clearly defined laws or statutes or policies, but the application of those and the interpretation of those are based on the specific circumstances of that case. So there's going to be commonalities for all of them, and then they're going to have their own unique elements, and it's up to those people on the ground to say, well, this is how we should apply this in this situation. because that allows for the lowest level of decision making. It
Yeah.
allows
Yeah.
for that discretion to take into account a number of factors. But the second you throw that zero tolerance, well, you just did something and technically it violates this. So you're we're going to apply this law to you that was never meant to be applied to you in this situation. And
Yes.
to me, it's like zero tolerance policies are lazy. And I got to correct you. You did say we don't, have any, zero tolerance policies. We don't support that. We have a zero tolerance policy on drug testing for our pediatric chiropractic.
Exactly.
We will
We're
never
staunchly against
tolerate
any
any
form.
drug
Yeah.
test. We do not tolerate drug testing in this organization. No,
And we don't take that
but
lightly, by the way.
but does that kind of make sense to you, Greg? Is like it
Yeah.
takes away the power of those on the ground and those people who know the ground truth the best. Are they always going to be right? No. But are they going to be right more than they're wrong? Typically. I mean, you
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? As long as you
Yeah.
have a well thought out plan and policy and they know how to implement it. Because once you just
Yep.
write something down and it's a checklist and it's like, well, they did this. Okay, well, then this has to happen. Okay, so cool. I just turned my brain off. Why don't you just have a fucking robot do my job? Because where's
Exactly.
the human in the loop in this? You get what I'm
And there's
saying?
human in the loop is an incredible distinction. Plus, there's empathy and compassion. The law is written with it. The law isn't blind. Justice is not blind when it comes to individuals and their antics. And sometimes people make silly mistakes, and we have to be able to walk that back. And I'll give you an example of how ludicrous it is. Go to any store or any restaurant, and you'll see a sign that says absolutely no dogs allowed. And then below it, what does it always say? Well, except for service dogs. Okay, well, then wait a
Right.
minute. You get what I'm trying to say? What you're doing is you're walking back in. Now I could go on because there's so many of these because you can't do this,
Yeah.
but in this instance, that's okay. Well, then don't have it in the first place because what happened is the knee jerk reaction to a specific incident created such a maelstrom that everybody wanted to jump on board and go, well, we'll never tolerate this again without clear heads thinking through what some of the after effects would be. And I'll give you a very brief story and then one that specifically targets yours. So I remember pulling over a car, traffic infraction, but that usually leads to bigger things. You know, the stop was on Eight
Yeah.
Mile, just off of DeQuinder in Detroit, and I walk up in a car and you can smell some weed. And the kid had a little stone, they called it back in the day, with a little one hit, and he was doing it on his way home from work. And he was coming from one job, going to another job, and Michigan was zero tolerance back then, zero marijuana, zero narcotic paraphernalia, go directly to jail, do not pass go. So the kid had a car seat in the back. I asked him about that. He's a young father. Mom's at home with the kid. She's also got a job. They got to do the handoff before he goes back later. And Brian, it was a horror story. And I'm
Yeah.
going to hook this kid. Do you get what I'm trying to say? For
Yeah.
misdemeanor possession of narcotic paraphernalia and marijuana. So what happened somehow? Gravity, entropy occurred, and the stone went up on a building near the site, and the weed fell out, and we called it Windy City back in the day, where it blew under the car and it was unrecoverable. And so, lesson learned. The kid wasn't a gosh darn dangerous felon. You know, nothing happened. Now, fast forward 20 years, I make a traffic stop up in, I got to be careful with attribution, as part of a drug team here in Colorado. And it's three kids, and they're partying their asses off, and they were going to the Air
Yeah.
Force Academy. And the kids were from the Air Force Academy, know what the standards are there, know that they're going to be pilots, know that they're going to do this. And it's their first year there, and they're up there and they got more dope in the car. I think the dope weighed more than the car. And so the incident was then, I had to take that, another zero tolerance situation. I had to take that and measure that against what I had done before in my career and said, this is unsafe at any speed. I got to tell somebody about this. And so that's a different standard. And somebody right now is going to go, "Oh, you dichotomous bitch! I can't believe that you did
Yeah.
that." No, yeah, I mean, there's one situation that these kids were out of control and they needed to be reined in, and there was a whole bunch of other policies that they discredited, that they had sworn to. That's a completely different situation. Is this poor guy that was coming back, so if you can wrap your mind around my decision making, that was because I didn't feel that zero tolerance could be applicable in both situations equally. And so I was stymied. I was on the ground going, okay, what do
Yeah.
I do in these situations? Now the law is very clear. Both people go to jail. Both
Yes.
people have the situation. I just didn't feel that way. And one more quick one. So you have Madison, Wisconsin, and you have a security guard copper that's working for the schools, a private contractor that's working for the Madison School District, and his name is Marlon Anderson. And what happens is a kid uses the N word because Marlon happens to be black in the hallways, and Marlon stops him and says in his response, "Hey, it's very disrespectful you to use that word," and says the same word that the kid uses back to the kid and says it's disrespectful, it's hurtful, please don't do that anymore. And they wrap up Marlon, the security guard,
Yeah.
and they fire him from his job for using it because it's expressly written in the policy of the school that no one shall, and this is the punishment when somebody uses it. So Brian, that look, now I've created a teeter totter, and now you've got
Yeah.
unequally weighted things on both sides of it, and one kid sitting up in the air going, hey, what the fuck, I mean, think about how
Yeah.
silly that feels.
And someone will also come in and say, "Well, you chose based on whatever reason to
Yep.
enforce these laws in a different manner for this group than you did for this group, so you're
Yep.
biased against that." And it's like no, which that's not that's not a ridiculous argument, right? I'm not saying that that doesn't have. Yes, that has absolutely happened, especially in the history of our country before, where
Yep.
certain people were prosecuted or more than others, and it's a brutal, ugly, horrible, awful thing,
Yes, it's
and
never good.
it still permeates in some places. It's just not what it used to be. But the thing is, when you don't allow for that, you're actually, my biggest problem with all these is that it's like you're dumbing everyone down, right? You're making us all dumber. You're saying, well, you
Right.
can't make that decision, Greg. You need to get higher approval, or we have to do this. And you know what?
Yep.
I'm going to come in and we're going to show you exactly how to do your job and what situations these work for. But the problem is, that's not how real life is. There's no,
No.
with the law has to be cut and dry, right? It has to be explicit and say, this is what it means. But the interpretation and the application of it, there's complexity in it. Like you
Yes.
just gave an example of two completely different situations, but with the same law. How can you tell me it's applied differently? Like those are the same thing. It's like, well, no, it's not.
It really
I
isn't.
mean,
Exactly.
well, there's no better way to look at it than even like the criminal justice system and how we apply different sentencing when they did minimum sentencing standards. It's like, okay, so you just took someone in their
Yes.
first offense for whatever this is, because it was crack cocaine and not regular powdered cocaine, and someone, when they were writing the law, didn't do the math correctly, and now that has a higher punishment, literally from a clerical error
Yeah.
in computation, and now that's in law. But this is what you have to do. It's like, well, like you're taking away the basic human ability, the what has kept
Yes.
society together for as long as humans have been around. It was this individual way of assessing a situation, having the learned folks
Yep.
apply things and go, well, based on what we know from the past, this is what's codified in the law, and this is what tradition is, and this is how we
Yep.
should apply it, because we don't just expel someone right away from society. We go, okay, we got to give them a chance. Now, if the severity of the situation or the crime is
Yes.
enough, then yeah, we say, hey, you got to go. You're fucking done, dude. You can't do that.
Exactly.
But this is my biggest overwhelming problem with any type of zero tolerance policy. You brought a great one right there of a school policy, of what someone said.
Yes.
There's different HR policies. There's the criminal justice system. And there's I and just so we're clear, like, we talked about recording this podcast. So I spent a significant amount of time trying to look for examples where zero tolerance policies are effective.
Yeah, where
And
they
I
worked.
had a
Right.
very I had a hard time, because
Yeah.
every time, and maybe it was just not giving the right type of Google prompts, but like I'm looking in there going like, when is this, I tried so many different searches, and it all popped up. Like everything that popped up was, that zero, like, another example of zero tolerance policy gone wrong. And so it's like, why do we have this? My biggest thing is, there's plenty of evidence. You can go look through there. There's people who've done meta-analysis. I'll have all the links, especially for our Patreon members, of just all of this evidence showing that, well, these really don't work. And then not just in like school settings, but in like
Yep.
HR type settings, and which is kind of like what you gave an example of. Yes, it took place in a school, but that would have been the same if it was a workplace or something like that,
Yep.
right?
Yes.
But why is this need? Why do we have this desire to do that? Where does this come from, Greg? And I'm going to kind of like asking your opinion on the matter and why we do this societally, or why lawmakers and policymakers go, well, we're just gonna, and why do people demand that type
Yes.
of response?
Yeah. Well, and I would say that's a great question, first of all, but I would say there's layers of the answer. So anytime that you hear Jude's law, inside joke, Marion's law, this type of thing, when people name something, okay, that shows that, yeah, we understand somebody died and you were hurt and it was horrible. But anytime we personalize the law, we stand in the face of these type of zero tolerance policies that you must do this or you shall do that. Now, some of them are for the greater good. For example, if you're going to be
Hmm.
a teacher of, junior high school kids, you should have a security clearance or whatever. Now, that's fine. That's not zero tolerance. That's zero tolerance. That's a policy that you can logically look at and go, oh, I see the reason for that. But then, saying something, my way or the highway, are you doing it for the right reasons? If somebody demonstrates intent, there's already laws against that. For example, bringing a school on the campus, whether there's a sign or not, that's a law. So the person can't say, I didn't know that it was illegal to carry a shotgun into a shopping center or those type of things, right? So what happens is we think that the more laws are on the books that we can hold it up and go, look what I did
Right.
during my tenure. The people asked for it and I did it. And guess what? Sometimes it's just ludicrous. And we as humans think, well, that makes me feel better because I can point to the guarantee on the
Right.
box. You get what I'm trying to say, and hold that thing up. So all of the speed limits and different signage. When you become a cop, you learn stuff you never knew. Like if you wondered how many feet and how many signs and no parking and soft shoulder and all that other stuff,
There's
all
very
that's regulated.
specific
It's very
rules to that.
specific.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
and once you start getting into that, you understand that we're a litigious society. And we're a society of written standards and policies and rules. And so this is just another example, Brian, of that overzealous thing, saying, one sign's good, let's put five. And it's not true. You'll have a link on, and folks, there's scientific experiment after experiment and legal scholars writing in about it. And that's how Brian and I started the argument, is saying, hey, what do the legal scholars think? What do the other people think? And just like Scared Straight, zero tolerance doesn't work. And it was
Yeah.
really, really hard to find any instance where there was a positive feedback from it. As a matter of fact, all of the instances I found were negative.
Yeah, there's plenty of examples of negative ones. It's
Sure.
just to me, it's really and my biggest problem with anytime you do that, it's just an oversimplification
Yep.
of how of our of protocol, procedure, or policy, right? We're just okay.
Yep.
Well, here's the thing we can point to, but really, like you said, the zero tolerance stuff is something that like it's obvious. Like you don't need to have a rule at your workplace saying no smoking crack in the break room. Like that's
Right.
that's
Right.
obviously.
We have
You
one
know what I mean? We have a zero
at
tolerance
Arcadia.
policy.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay,
So
yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you don't it becomes obvious and apparent,
yeah.
right? And so my biggest problem with all of these is you take away any sort of, like I mentioned, this discretionary um, you know, way of applying policy and procedure. And
Yes.
everyone's scared of that. And we're scared of that at scale, but we all want to do it individually, right? So we want to micromanage how things are going to happen and what books are in the school. Like we can't even figure out the best way to educate children, right? We haven't even crossed that. We haven't checked that box yet, but we're already saying here's what you should be teaching them, or here's what you should.
Yeah.
It's like, well, wait, we haven't even agreed on how the best way of going about doing this is, let alone the specifics of this subject and this thing. But what I'm getting at is like we have this like as humans, we don't like to be individually. We hate being micromanaged. Everyone's just let me do my job. How many times like, dude, I
Yes.
got this boss I got to go to. I got to report. Everyone complains about their process at their work or things that they're micromanaged and they can't ever do it and they get shit from their boss and everyone hates boss. Are you a boss? Are you a manager? Are you a leader? Like then we have to get those right. Everyone hates that shit. Yet when it
Yes.
comes to these policies and laws, like people demand it. Well, we zero tolerance. We cannot do this. It's like, all right, man. Like that those two ways of thinking are, they conflict with one another. It's like you have to allow a certain amount of leeway and a certain amount of discretionary
Yep.
ability to you, as long as you have oversight, then it's okay. I mean, you can go to like government, especially like military examples where, they put down, all right, hey, we're going to allow lower level units to have more discretion about how they spend training money or what equipment they buy or something like this, right?
Yep.
So you didn't have to go through the long process, and it's faster acquisition, it's faster this. Well, it's just like the whatever the PPP loans or something. Like what happens when you just allow that to occur? Or is there going to be fraud, waste, and abuse? Yes,
Of
because if
course.
you don't put in the oversight of it, if you don't put in these limiting factors, then that's the issue. But no one wants to go through the details of what that is, because it's complex and it's tough, and those are tough calls. And so it's like I always just see it sort of as this sort of dichotomous way that humans are, right? We hate it personally, individually,
Yep.
but societally we know we need to sort of give up some of our freedoms or agencies to live in a society, right? You have to. There's always
Yep.
a balance between security and safety and civil liberty, like that's all, that's constantly in flux. Like the more laws we have, well, the less freedoms we have. I mean, right? And so it's one of these things that I just anytime I see something zero tolerance, it's like it's like a little, like I get like a little jab in the stomach. I get the cortisol drop. I'm like, God, like why are you doing that? Just in, you say you want to invest in your people and you want to nurture them and get them better, but yet you restrict them to these specific policies that they have no control over. Well, then
Yep.
then you're not investing in your people. You're not putting trust in your people. You know what I'm saying? And that's the
Yeah.
biggest thing
So
too. Out of like the HR examples for the private sector workplace came out. It's like, look, these zero tolerance policies don't work. What works is having open communication, understanding of the application of policies, right? Teamwork, like building a trust in your people with leadership. Like if you have that, you don't need a zero tolerance policy, because
right.
some of the things are already implied, right? I mean, it just they bother me. It's
I
what
I
it is.
counter I counter with a parallel argument that there are amendments to the U.S. Constitution.
Hmm.
And that is because learned people sat down and said, man, we got to fix this. And there are Colorado revised statutes, for example, for the law. And revised means that we went back and looked at these, and these are better laws than those were. And it's not knee jerk. And it's not a quick reaction from it. It's where people took time. Look, I say this a lot when we're in person to other people. Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, was legal in the
Hmm.
60s because there was no laws against it and people
Yeah.
built it. And until somebody came together and say, wow, there's a lot more deadly and detrimental effects to this, and then they had to enact things. So what has to happen is people, like, look, if the dike is leaking, you got to stick a finger. Okay, I get that, but those knee-jerk stopgap methods have to become corrected and codified over time with research and diligence. And we're not doing that. We're saying, okay, well, this place has a lot of gun violence. Well, we got to have a shot spotter, and they changed their name, by the way. And then this school has this, so we got to build, a bigger wall and a bigger fence and a bigger this, and then let's add dogs, and then let's add dogs as bees in their mouth. That's the exact
Bees in their
thinking,
mouth.
Brian, that got us here with this discussion on zero tolerance. And listen to me, if you're hearing my voice, we're not saying that all zero tolerance is wrong. We're saying that we're really, really trying to find one or two policies that save stuff. And somebody's going to counter, it's always school shootings. Somebody's going to counter, well, we saved this school shooting. There was just a caper where the FBI had been following a guy January, February, March, and just arrested him because he was going to go and shoot up a concert, wanted to start a race war before elections, all this other stuff. And when you read through that thing, that needed to happen. We need to do that. But there was no zero tolerance policy in there. What it was is this
Right.
nutcase was making threats and this stuff.
Yeah.
So the investigation led to this other. That's called due process. And due process
Yeah.
trumps all those other things. When
Everything.
policies trump logic, we have a problem. We have a big problem because then it takes due process out of the equation. And now we can no longer see a situation clearly. That's like, let's only enact laws after a school shooting. Well, wait a minute. We know there's going to be another school shooting. We know there's going to be another Pulse nightclub shooting. It's just a matter of how we are as a society. So if we're going to enact and do research, now's the time. No better time than the present. And there's things out there that are so dichotomous, like a school policy on message on your clothing, or the one that I sent you
Yeah.
about
Oh
Morgan
yeah, we see
Stanley.
those ones. Yeah.
Those right here. What you have is you have somebody's idea of future. Well, listen, I'm imposing this restriction on you because I think of it might cause something in the future. Well, wait a minute. Okay, I'm all for predictive analysis, but I can't charge you for a crime you haven't committed. And so,
Yeah.
assuming that I'm seeing, this crime set up, the Morgan Stanley one, Brian. Now that was 9 years ago, I think, if I'm correct. But the idea is it wasn't for trading violations or client complaints. What happened is their biggest private wealth brokers, the biggest producers that they had at Morgan Stanley, were engaging in personal conduct and according to the people that invoked the zero tolerance, that their misbehavior off duty was probably going to spill over at work. So we better
Yeah,
nip it
you
in the
can't.
bud now by
Oh man.
creating this. And what they did is they didn't have a tangible look. It's cause and effect, but you have to have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. You have to have demonstrations of intent. I can't say that, hey, we're going to put an intersection here because one day this city's going to expand, so we're going to put lights here and safety now because in 27 years some kid's going to be skateboarding and he might hit his head. You don't do that. That's not how we work. So there's a
Right.
balance, again, back to the teeter totter,
There's a
back to the
balance.
seesaw. There's a balance, and that balance is always precarious. And if we're going to write it down and put it on a sign, Brian, we should be more diligent in the research.
Yeah, and I think it's I think that this is ultimately lazy is what it
I
is. Like when you just say that this is what we're gonna it
Placating.
means I don't
Yeah,
want to take the time to go through this because, even with like different military examples for different requirements for certain things, here's the requirements, but you can get a waiver if you don't meet those
there's a waiver.
requirements. And it's like,
Yep,
well why? Because that's someone then taking the time to go, well, what is it? What is it about your unique situation on why you should still be allowed here or able to do this job, even though you don't meet this requirement or you did something before in your past? And you investigate it, you look at it, and then you give a thumbs up or thumbs down. And you're
yeah,
not going to be right 100% of the time, but no one's ever right 100% of the time. But the idea is like, you have a process in there to go, well, this is an exception. All right, there's exceptions to certain rules, and
yes,
as there should be. I mean, you can't have this cut and dry way of doing it, and it's just I think it's just lazy, and this is the effect it has
yep,
is then it permeates kind of societally and within an organization, and then we just get lazy with everything, and then we just go,
yep,
well, I don't want to deal with this. There's all this pressure societally to handle this problem or whatever, so
yep,
we'll just say this is the zero tolerance policy. It's like, well, you're going to screw someone over and you're going to screw someone over pretty bad. And then
yep,
sometimes they're
yep,
probably going to come back and sue you and you're going to lose out in the long run. And
yep.
you just like, it's the dumbing down of us as humans.
Yep, and the Liam Morrison at Nichols Middle School is a perfect example of this. So you can't choose when you're going to impose a very strict violation like that, and this goes right back to, are both of those dope cases the same? So he goes to school at Nichols Middle School in Massachusetts wearing the "there are only two genders" shirt, and the school says, take it off. And he says, I'm not taking it off. So they said, you got to take it off or you're going home. So he goes in the other room and he puts tape over the their only part, and taking away the two genders. And they go, not close enough. It's exhibiting such hate speech, according to their dress code violation, which stated must not state, implied, depict hate speech, imagery, targets. Right. So they're saying this one is so profoundly hate speech that you got to take it off or go home. Now, this kid has a history of wearing shirts that are always talking about First Amendment, Second Amendment, these rights and stuff. And the idea is that his First Amendment right to free speech shall not be infringed. Right. The idea is that his argument is, I've got all these kids for different LGBTQ plus, different things that they do at home, different non-binary whatever context, that they're wearing the shirts for it. And the teacher said, that's not our job. Our job is to enforce the violation of the dress code. And so you have to take that off. So he's looking for parity. He's saying, wait a minute, if that's okay, why isn't mine okay?
Yeah.
And the school says in their answer to this, because he recently lost the case against it because their local version of the Supreme Court said, hey, wait a minute, this one doesn't stand because it's in a violation of the dress code and was going to cause
Right.
unlawful, just imminent unlawful activity because of him wearing it. So they thought the longer that he wore that, the other kids in school would get amped up, and sooner or later a fight would break out. Brian, there again, I'm saying, wait a minute. What are we talking about? My standard was this. This guy's doing nothing wrong. He's just going home. He made a violation of a misdemeanor ordinance. It shouldn't cost him the rest of his life and his job and going to jail and thousands of dollars he couldn't afford. These other kids, they knew better. It was part of their code, their ethical code that they took. Now here we got a kid that's wearing a shirt, and you know what? If you're going to send him home, I get it. Okay, that's okay. But then reap the whirlwind when it comes back around with all the other instances. Now, somebody's going to say, well, that's kind of a weak example. No, it's not, because the policy is clearly designed to keep those kids safer at school because they shouldn't have to contend with this shit. But then if you're going to have that policy, it's got to be equal across the board. How are you going to
Yeah.
enforce that? How?
Well,
You know,
that's where these zero tolerance policies come from. It's not from something obvious like, yeah, you can't bring a gun to school. Like, okay, like that's
we get it. Right, right.
understood. But it comes from these cases, and it's someone wearing a T-shirt with the same. And there's countless, so all the way up to the Supreme Court
You
cases,
know that. Yep.
going back. There's a lot of legal precedent for that, and free speech is, especially if it's a public school, because they work for the public school as part of the
Yep.
state. They have, they don't have as much leeway, let's say, as like a private school. Private school can just tell you like, no, you can't wear that. Get that. I don't
Whatever they
care. They can
want.
make up
Yep.
their own rules, right? But it's very different in a public school, and so those are the types of cases that people don't want to jump into, and so we just go, you know what, fine, no one's wearing shirts with any message on it, and it's like,
Exactly.
well, like, so I can't wear a shirt that says I love this school, I love my parents, or
Nope.
something, like, you know what I mean, like that's
Because it
what
would be a
happens, and
classification. It
it's
would be a
lazy.
group. Exactly. Exactly.
And that's where the laziness comes in, and they don't want to have those difficult conversations, when in fact, like, that's where those difficult conversations should be had, at a local
Right.
level, at the school, with those kids, doing that. Like, okay, well, you're showing support for one issue, I'm so showing support for another issue. That's fine. Like, but we don't want to, we can't piss off these people because they'll
Yep.
sue us. It's like, well, then this person's going to sue you. Like, just
Yep.
just deal with the problem, and stop relegating things to an oversimplified solution, and
Yep.
because it's going to come back up again. It's not like, oh, we just get through this one case and we're good. No, all cases inform other future cases, and so therefore, like, you kind of got to deal with it now. And that's my biggest issue with all of this. It's just like, well, let's just make it simple. Well, every time you do that, we get a little bit dumber. Like, every time we
I
do
think
those
so.
things, we don't have those conversations. One, it's bad for the kids, man. They're at the best chance to learn that at that age than they are when they're adults and they're set in their ways, right?
Yes.
Because that, like, we use it as a teachable moment. I mean, it's a school. Everything, literally everything that happens throughout the day is a fucking teachable moment in
I
some
agree.
way, shape, or form. It's a school. They're kids, so show it, show them everything. You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing, is like, why can't they learn then? Because
Yep.
they're going to probably interpret it better than the parents are.
Yep.
Just because they're not thinking of, oh, I have kids here and I'm worried about this and I have this life experience. They're just like, what's the issue? They're literally a
Yep.
clean slate, going like, I don't see, tell me what the problem is, because you're teaching me. And
Well,
we're teaching them that,
exactly.
just to oversimplify everything, and you know what, your thing doesn't matter as much as that thing, and this thing is, well, it's different. And it's like, well, if you can't explain it to a kid at school, then you don't know the issue very well.
Right.
That's the way I look at it.
Well, and look, the reason I brought up Marlon Anderson with the Madison School District and Nichols Middle School and Liam Morrison is they're both sides of the same coin. Somebody's going to think that they're both sides of a spectrum. They're not. Okay. I agree with having policies and dress codes because if they're equally applied, they lessen the risk that might
Yeah.
go along with threats of violence and those type of mayhem that could cause that happen at school, because kids are kids and they don't understand things and they'll act out and act up. Look at this whole thing with the college campuses now. I don't know much about this issue, but I'm willing to fight and die for it. Okay, so I agree with that. But what happened is the policy went to the point where Marlon Anderson is fired for telling the kid not to use the word that the kid used. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to say. We have to. I think we have to be careful of the extremes. And here we are again with overreach in the policy where we're saying, the Morrison argument is, look, I only wore it because everybody else is wearing something pro this or pro that, and the school didn't say anything. So, to that end, I agree with the argument, and I always side with free speech. But I do also understand that the school has the right to enforce a dress code. So,
Oh yeah.
don't think that we're giving a
Yeah.
mixed message here. What we're saying is case by case basis. And you're saying, well, I don't have time for
Well,
that. And we're saying you got to make time for that.
well, this is why we go with demonstrations of intent are more important than
Totally agree.
motive. Like, what, you know what I mean? Like, what is your intent behind doing this? Like,
Yes.
and that's the big thing. If you came in intending to piss off a group of people, well, you're a fucking asshole. Like,
Right.
just say you're. I mean, support what you want to support, but like, are you directing something towards someone? And when you get into just what is your intent behind something, it's
Yes.
that's even easier with kids, because most of the time it's like, well, I don't they probably didn't even think that far into it, so it's like,
Nope.
okay, you know what I mean? Like, you didn't put a whole lot of thought into this, you just,
Right.
which is okay, you're just being a child, got it, like, you're a teenager, you're this, like,
Trying to figure
okay,
things
like,
out. Sure.
you're figuring shit out. Yeah,
Yep.
that's, you get leeway in there, versus if you're, you're a 30-year-old person walking into a place and work and with something very specific, right?
Yep.
When I focus on intent, like, but it cuts through all of these situations. Like, what is the intent of this policy then? So if I go back to the original story from the Chicago Public Schools, what was the intent? Well, the intent of the policy was, one, we want to protect students, but there's certain circumstances, like an active shooter situation. So they took it literally, like, well,
Precisely.
this isn't an active shooter. It's like, but it's like, no, 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 but it this affects the safety and welfare of the students, and it involves
Yep.
students at this school. We still need to apply it here. And they're like, well, that's not what it says in the law. It's like, you know what it is? That's the intent behind it. That's the
Right.
intent behind what this
And the
is. It's
speed
for this
of
type of
this action is
situation.
essential. Exactly. Exactly.
And
Because it's
and
rare,
and
Brian,
it,
because it
whether
doesn't happen every day. That's the whole point behind those type of laws, right?
and I think you can even start with that when you're crafting what that policy is going to be. It's like, what is your intent with this policy? And you can spell that out. And
Yep.
then once you have the intent clear, you can then figure out, well, how does that work here at our school or here at our office? What does that mean at this
Yep.
location? And then we can sit there and go, "Well, let's come up with some potential situations that we might run into." And like,
Table topic. Yes.
this is not like some exhaustive, meticulous process that you know what I mean? Like, you can
Yep.
sit there with people, go, okay, what are we likely going to see with this, and play it out. And when you do that, it helps you craft what the intent behind your message
I agree.
is, and it creates the intent behind the policy. And I think that's everything. And it's the same thing with determining what this person meant by that, by the message clothing, or by the threat that they made. What is their intent
Precisely. Or
behind
their
it?
actions. Right. Right. Those are all hugely important.
Yeah, because otherwise it gets into, like, I don't care what the message is on the shirt necessarily. Are you just trying to be provocative? Are you trying to be
Right.
evocative? Are you trying to just piss people off? Like, whatever the message or the group that you're identifying with, it's like, that's fine. You get to be that as a human. You get to be part of all kinds of different groups. But what is your intent with the action you
Yep.
just took?
Yep.
And it helps clarify it, because then I can use that no matter what side of the issue it is. And it helps me just maintain some clarity. Are you exercising your First Amendment right? Or are you here to start a riot? You know what I mean? Like, those are two
Precisely.
different things.
Right, and
So
that's a predictive analysis tool that could be applied in this situation. The lowest level argument is we have a policy against that. Totally agree, as long as it's uniformly applied. Then the second thing is somebody goes, okay, it can't be uniformly applied because this is a one-off situation. Okay, agreed. Let's bring it in. Is this the proper venue to have this fight? Is this a fight that we should have in front of the students on this day at that time that might hurt somebody needlessly? Why don't we take this to the superintendent's office? We bring in, the voices that need to be heard on this issue, and we go in this instance. Now that's something that everybody is going to go for, because look, what does due process say? You have your day
Yeah.
in court. You have your time. That's not what we were doing. And Brian, I just want to make sure, if we have a chance, that we cover the Scotty Scheffler incident, because here's a perfect example of a guy demonstrating intent over and over and over, and then a policy
Can,
is used
can
to
can you give us
circumvent everything.
can you give us a recap of that one?
So Louisville PD, okay,
Yeah.
they're investigating a fatal accident right outside where the golfing is having one of their biggest events ever. Number one ranked golfer Scotty Scheffler is on the way, and he's running a little late. So all traffic is blocked. So he violates all traffic laws to circumvent the blockade they've got at the fatal. Drives in oncoming traffic for a significant amount of time, violating all these laws and rules for safety, and he gets pulled over stopped by a couple of coppers, including a detective that doesn't have his body camera on. For whatever reason, he doesn't have his body camera on.
Yeah.
He tells Scheffler, "Hey, you got to stop the car. You got to get out of the car." Scheffler drives off, dragging the copper for a distance. And what happened is, after all the press going both way, but that's Scotty Scheffler. Hey, there's a different standard. And clearly, Scotty felt there was a different standard. What happens is the Louisville PD comes in and goes, "Hey, we have a uniform policy that says that thou shalt do this," and he didn't do it, so we're dropping the charges against Scheffler. And it's hard, Brian, to
Yeah.
look at that one and go, "Wait a minute,
Wait a minute. Yeah.
the fix was in early on this one, right?" And
Yeah.
so the cop gets reprimanded, and they drop the charges. And think of those: if it was you or I, would
Yeah.
the justice have been applied the same way? And I think that's what we all want. We want our day in court. We want our due process. And you know what? If we do something completely boneheaded like that, we should expect to get pulled over. And the idea is, Scheffler made some off the cuff comment, and you folks, do your homework, read the article where he said, "Yeah, I knew I hit somebody, but I didn't know it was a cop." Okay, wait a minute. Those demonstrations of intent
Yeah.
started
What's
building from the
that's
beginning.
not
Just,
that's
you know,
what the fuck does
Your
that
Honor,
even
that's the
mean?
boys will be
Oh,
boys
yeah. Well,
defense.
I didn't know he was an old feeble man when I pushed him down. I thought he was a
Exactly.
kid. It's like,
When
wait
I
a minute,
fired the
like
shot
it's
at his chest, I wasn't quite sure that the bullet would penetrate. No, and what we do sometimes,
yeah,
Brian, is we placate things like Liam Morrison. Good on you that you're thinking about the constitutional amendments and your First Amendment right and everything else. But school's not the place to wear that flag. Do you get
yeah,
what I'm trying to say? Take it out of there. And so while I side with the Massachusetts court, my fear is that it's going to go higher, because it's an issue that we all worry about, our free speech. And sometimes, Brian, we fight for free speech even if it's a shitty argument. And that hurts me too, because
yeah,
when we start thinking about that, people don't understand the effect that something like free speech can have on it. I actually wrote down, if I can find my note quickly about that gosh darn it, that when we take those things in, Brian, what we don't think is, we don't think of the impact that our words have. and
yeah,
and we have to understand that when we take a look at the way the law is, we can't make those short. Yeah, never going to be able to find my note on it. We're not going to be able to understand the effects of that knee-jerk reaction to a one-off incident. And that's also why I'm saying, when we name them, and it's
yeah,
Megan's law. Okay, I
yeah,
get that, but what we're doing is we're sort of bottlenecking it at this point in a series of facts that may never happen. Look, we all want the same thing. We don't want crime. We don't want terrorism. We don't want to be raped. We don't want our property stolen, all that. And I think there's plenty of precedent that shows that we do those things well. It's these things where,
yeah.
when the light shines on them, they're a little bit different, like the Scheffler thing. I haven't followed the caper because we've been busy. But Brian, did he issue an apology at least? Did he say, "Hey, look, kids, this isn't the way that you want to do it"? And why didn't we get all the information? Because he's famous, because he's a hell of a
Yeah.
golfer. And that's the
Yeah,
same
he's
thing
really
that I'm
well
afraid.
liked, and everyone says he's a super
And
nice
and
guy and all that. Yeah,
Exactly. And
yeah,
to go back, just remember, everybody, Marlon Anderson got his job back. Why? Because enough people said, "Wait a minute, this is a good guy. This guy did everything right, and this law is wrong. It's broken." So going back and fixing a broken law is great. The same thing with Benito Juarez Community Academy. Okay, they had to know that they were skating on thin ice, and violating the CPD, the Chicago PD openly like that, what did that do? Did that restore any faith in the
Yeah.
community or in the school or in the cops? You see what I'm trying to say? So those long-lasting effects from a short-term decision, Brian, are some of the most disastrous, and we really have to focus on those.
Yeah, we don't, I don't know. It's like you can do both. You can think globally or strategically and then act locally or tactically, right? You
Yep,
can do that. You can say, okay, I have to make a decision on the specific case, but I have to take into account the overarching effect it will have, not just on the specific case, but overall.
absolutely.
And like you got to balance that out. And I think that helps with a little bit of understanding on how to approach these issues. Is yes, we have to, people are upset about this thing, so let's deal with it. But how does that fit into the overall big picture? And is this
Exactly.
is this the one we want to go all in on, or is this something that's going to pop? You know what I mean? It just to sort of think strategically, but act tactically.
Yep.
Is what I would say, or decide tactically. That's kind of how I look at it. But
Yeah, and
yeah,
we also, Brian, I think we also have to take a look at outdated concepts. Like I'm ambivalent about the scales of justice because I absolutely love the law. You know me, but when we take a look at that, we've forgotten the message. Justice is blind was intended to say that it's going to be equally applied no matter how much money you have, no matter the
mhm,
color of your skin or your religion. Then we see the scales. Well, the old standard was the preponderance of evidence. The more evidence you had that tended to show one side over the other meant that you would win. And we know that's wrong. So now it goes down to case by case basis, putting yourself in the shoes at that time, at that place, and then looking at evidence, artifacts and evidence that support. And then we have bench trials and jury trials. So that thing, which we all understand, listen, when we get the balance out, then it's going to be great. We know that it's been problematic. So here's a time in our lives where we could make a big change and restore some order by going back and saying, hey, these capers are important. Look, you know what you and I do? We pick out capers and talk about it for an hour that nobody's ever heard of. I'm saying, why haven't you heard of
yeah,
these cases? Why aren't you more outraged that it took 2 years for Benito Juarez Community Academy and the CPD to come to a realization that things needed to be fixed, Brian, on both sides, like the after
yeah.
action review. That became a contentious situation. How can it? These are all things that are meant to make us safer and lubricate the wheels of justice, and they did exactly the opposite, and that gives me pause.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. There's kind of a lot of different cases we brought up as examples in the episode, and just I think it's an easy way out. If you want to hit the easy button, sure, create a zero tolerance policy. It's going to come back and bite you in the ass, but hey, you didn't have to do any work right now. I mean, that's my big
Yeah,
thing. It's like they're complex, they're tough, but they're not outside of the span of someone's control or what you can do at a very simple level. Like this isn't,
exactly.
don't overthink it when it comes to this stuff. I mean, just what's the best way to enforce this for where I'm at right now? How does that fit into the bigger picture? And is this a trend or something I'm going to see? How much weight do we have to put on this case? You know what
I
I mean? And
I agree.
is this the one we want to go all in on? You know what I mean? Because it might not be, and
Yep,
and just that knee jerk reaction again is rarely a good one. But
total
yeah, well,
agreement.
we appreciate everyone for tuning in. There's a lot more on the Patreon site. You can go ahead and
Yep,
check the links in the episode details. Go over there. There's all kinds of different content that we have on there. We deep dive some of these topics. We give different examples and behavior breakdowns. All that stuff is all on there for you to check out. And then also you can reach out to us at the human behavior podcast at gmail.com. And we appreciate all of you tuning in and for supporting the show. So thank you so much. And don't forget that training changes behavior.